Once upon a time, there was a poor miller who had 3 sons. When the miller died, he left them everything he had in the world, which wasn't much. To the eldest son, he left his mill. To his second son, he left his donkey. But to the youngest son, all he could leave was a cat. "A cat," said the poor boy. "What good is a cat?" He was very sad. "Now, hold on," said the cat. One of the first things you noticed about this cat was that he could talk. "Hold on," he said. "You get me a bag with a string around the top and a pair of boots, and I'll show you that things are not as bad as they appear." That seemed an odd request for a cat, a pair of boots, but this was an odd cat. So the miller's son got Puss a bag, an old laundry bag, I guess, and he scraped together enough money to buy him a little pair of boots. They were shiny black, with red heels and fancy tops, and I can tell you Puss was a proud, high-stepping cat when he put them on. The first thing he did was to take his bag and go out into a field where he knew there were a lot of rabbits. He put some carrots in the bag and spread it out on the ground, and then he lay down beside it and pretended he was dead. Well, you know rabbits. They have no more sense than to fall for a trick like that. Sure enough, one of them came sniffing around the bag, and when he smelled the carrots, he crawled inside after him. Puss just lay there with one eye half open, not making a sound, but inside he was going, and the minute he saw that rabbit's little white tail disappear into the bag, what? He pounced on it and pulled the string tight. And there he had it. Now, an ordinary cat might have taken the rabbit to a butcher, sold him for a small profit, and been satisfied with that. But not Puss. He was a cat with big ideas. He did everything in a big way. He slung the bag over his shoulder and started off to see the king, no less. The king was in his throne room just killing time when his sergeant-at-arms came in. "Yes," said the king, "what is it?" "Cat to see you," said the sergeant-at-arms. "A cat? A cat? Well, I'll be a monkey's uncle," the king said. "Show this cat in." The sergeant gave a signal. A door opened. There was a fanfare. And in marched Puss, a fine figure of a cat in his shiny new boots. He laid the rabbit he had caught at the king's feet and made a low bow and said, "O king, live forever." "Thanks," said the king, "but what have we here?" "I have brought you, sire, a rabbit," said Puss, "with the compliments of my master, the noble Marquis of Carabas." Now, there was no such person as the Marquis of Carabas. That was just a name Puss made up for his master because he thought it sounded grand. But the king was very pleased, and when Puss came the next day with a present of some partridges that he had bagged, the king began to think this Marquis of Carabas must be a pretty fine fellow and a good man to know. Yeah. By the way, you better go turn over the record. I'll wait. One day when Puss knew that the king was going for a drive along the river with his daughter, who incidentally was the most beautiful princess in the world, he went running to his master and said, "Master, this is your big chance. Go jump in the river." His poor master was feeling pretty low about then and had half a mind to jump in the river anyway, so he did as he was told. Puss hid his clothes under a rock. When the royal coach came driving by, the cat began to whoop and holler, "Oh, man overboard! Help! Help! The Marquis of Carabas is drowning!" Immediately the king cried, "Halt!" and he ordered his guards to go to the rescue of the Marquis. While they were pulling the poor fellow out of the river, Puss told the king that some burglars had stolen his master's clothes while he was in swimming, so he had nothing to wear. "A fine thing," said the king, and he sent for one of his own best suits for the Marquis. Now, the miller's son may have been no Marquis, but he was a good-looking young fellow, and when he got into the king's clothes, he was so doggone handsome, the princess fell head over heels in love with him. "You know, Papa," she said, "I think it would be nice if we invited the Marquis to ride in our coach with us." "By all means," said the king. "Shove over." So the miller's son climbed in, and the coach started gaily off again, and ahead of it went Puss, strutting along in his fine new boots. It was really a glorious day. The king enjoyed looking at the countryside, and the princess and the Marquis enjoyed looking at each other. Puss ran on ahead, and presently he came to a beautiful big meadow which some farmers were mowing. Puss swaggered up to one of the men and pretended to be very tough. "Who's in charge here?" he demanded. The man replied, "I am." Puss looked him in the eye. "Well, listen, bub," he said. "I'm telling you this for your own good. The king is coming by here in a minute, and when he does, you tell him that this meadow belongs to the Marquis of Carabas. Because if you don't," he said, "I'll have your heads chopped off. All of you." The farmer said, "Yes, sir." And when the king came along and inquired who owned that fine meadow, The farmers all said, "The Marquis of Carabas, yes, sir." A little farther along, they came to a rich cornfield that stretched as far as the eye could see. And there were reapers by the roadside harvesting the corn. But Puss got there first, and he told the men, "If you don't tell the king that this cornfield belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, I'll see to it personally that you're all chopped up as fine as mincemeat." So when the king leaned out of his coach and asked the men, "Who owns all this?" they replied at once, "The Marquis of Carabas, lock, stock, and barrel." And the king was much impressed. Puss was well ahead of him by this time, and he came at last to a stately castle which belonged to a rich retired ogre. He owned all the land for miles around, and people lived in terror of him. But do you think Puss was afraid? Huh? If you want to find out, go change the record while I light a cigar. Let's see now. Where were we? Oh, yes. At the ogre's castle. Puss didn't like this part of it, but he walked up to the castle and rapped bravely on the door, and a mighty voice inside bellowed, "Who's there?" But when the ogre opened the door and saw that it was only a cat with boots on, he laughed. Did you ever hear an ogre laugh? Yeah. "Come on in," he said. "Come on in and sit down. What do you know? What's new?" Well, they talked about one thing and another, how the country was going to pot, and with taxes so high a man could hardly make both ends meet. And finally Puss said slyly, "You know, I heard something about you." "What did you hear about me?" the ogre asked. "Oh, it probably isn't true," Puss said. "You know how these stories get around. But I heard you were so powerful that you could change yourself into any kind of animal you want to. Of course, I don't believe it." "You don't believe it, eh?" said the ogre. "Stand back." And all of a sudden, he was a roaring lion. Puss was so frightened he jumped right out of his boots. "I believe you," he cried. "Nice lion, nice lion." The lion laughed, and in a flash he was only an ogre again. "That's not a bad trick," Puss admitted. "Not bad," the ogre said. "I'd like to see anybody else do it." "Well," Puss said, "if you wanted to do a real trick." "No, but you couldn't do it." "I couldn't do what?" the ogre asked. "No, you couldn't do this," Puss said. "Listen," the ogre replied. "You name it and I'll do it." "All right," said Puss. "I'll bet you my boots you can't change yourself into an animal as small as a rat." "A rat," the ogre said. "That's nothing. You watch and I'll turn myself into a mouse." And by George, he did. He turned into a mouse and ran around the floor squealing. That was just what Puss was waiting for. He sprang at the mouse and caught him and gobbled him up. And that was the end of the ogre. Well, when the king and the princess and Puss's master came driving up to the castle, Puss ran out to greet them. "Welcome," he cried. "Welcome to the castle of the Marquis of Carabas." "What?" said the king. "Does this fine castle belong to the Marquis too?" The king got out of the coach and looked about him. As pretty a piece of property as I ever saw, he thought. And to the miller's son, he said, "My lord Marquis, if you don't marry my daughter, and right away, it'll be your own fault." That was all the Marquis needed. The princess and he were married that very same day, and they lived happily ever after. And as for Puss, he became a great lord, and never chased mice anymore, except now and then for fun. Once upon a time, there was a man who loved to boast. The funny part of it was, he hadn't a thing in the world to boast about, except his daughter. Oh, his daughter was very beautiful, and that was a fact. But that wasn't enough for him. He had to go around boring people with stories about how clever she was. And I'm afraid that sometimes he exaggerated a little. "Why, do you know," he said one time, "that girl is so clever. She's so clever that she can spin gold out of straw." Well, nobody paid much attention to him, but the story got around, and finally it reached the king. Now, this king was very fond of money. He used to collect it. He'd like to wander around the palace and jingle it in his royal robes. In fact, that was all he ever thought about. Money, money, money. So when he heard there was a girl in his kingdom who could spin gold from straw, he ordered it brought to him at once. "But your majesty," the poor girl said, I can't spin gold from straw." The king was suspicious. "You're just saying that," he said. And he led her to a room where there was a big pile of straw and a spinning wheel. "Get to work," he told her, "and if all this straw isn't gold by morning, it'll be just too bad." And he slammed the door and locked her in. The poor girl threw herself on the floor and began to weep. When suddenly the door opened, and in walked a funny little man. I give you my word, he was no taller than a wheelbarrow. He had a long beard and a pointed hat, and he wore a little green vest with a great big watch and chain. "Hello, beautiful," he said. "Why all the tears?" She told him all the trouble she was in, how if she didn't spin the straw into gold before morning, she would surely be killed. "What'll you give me," asked the little man, "if I do it for you?" "Oh, anything," she said. "I'll give you my necklace." It was a deal. He sat down at the spinning wheel, and round it went, till he had spun all the straw into gold. When the king came in the next morning, he was delighted. But instead of letting the poor girl go, he took her into another room where there was even a bigger pile of straw. "I don't have to tell you," he said, "that if all this straw isn't gold by morning, you will meet a fate so horrible that I can't even think what it is." That night the same thing happened. The little man returned, and the poor girl offered him her ring, which was the only thing she had left. And before morning the job was all done. When the king came in, he could hardly believe his eyes. "By George," he thought, "this girl is a gold mine." He led her to a third room, even larger, where there was easily 1.5 tons of straw. "I'll tell you what I'm going to do," he said. "If you spin all this into gold, I'll marry you and make you my queen." Big-hearted. "But I can't," she cried. "Tut, tut, my dear," the king said. "Never say can't." And he closed the door softly, but just the same, he locked it. This time the girl really was in trouble, for she had no jewelry left to offer the little man when he came. Would you like to know what she did? Well, I'll tell you, but you'll have to go change the record first. When the little man came to the room where the poor girl had been locked up, all she could do was throw herself on his mercy and beg him to help her. "Well, I'm losing money on this," the little fellow said, "but I'll do it if you promise one thing. Promise me that when you're queen, you'll give me your first child." The wretched girl gave him her promise. What else could she do? And sure enough, the next day the king married her and made her his queen. Oddly enough, they got along together very well, as royal marriages go, and in due time they had a baby. The queen was so happy she forgot all about her promise to the little man with the beard, till one day he arrived and announced that he had come for the child. The queen wept and pleaded and wept some more. She wept so piteously, and she was so doggone beautiful that the little man gave in. "I don't know why I do this," he said. "I'm a fool. But if you can tell me within 3 days what my name is, you can keep your baby." Well, sir, the queen almost went crazy trying to think what the little man might be called. The first day when he came, she tried simple names like Elmer and Mac and Joe, but she could see at once that they didn't fit. "You'll have to do better than that," the little fellow said, and he went off rubbing his hands and chortling in glee. The second day, she failed again. By this time, she was so terrified she went and told her husband about the whole thing, and the king issued a royal proclamation. "Everybody think up names!" The next morning, a messenger arrived at the court. "I haven't thought of any names," he said, "but yesterday when I was going through the woods, I came upon a little hut. In front of the hut there was a fire, and a funny little man was dancing round and round it, singing this song. Bring me cookies, bring me wine, tomorrow night the baby's mine. If I don't win this guessing game, Rumpelstiltskin's not my name." When the queen heard this, she jumped for joy. She couldn't wait for the little man to get there. He arrived just at sundown with a big sack to carry the baby off in. "All right," he said, taking out his watch. "Start guessing." "Is your name Horace?" she asked. "Nope." "Is it Humphrey?" "You're cold." "It isn't Throckmorton?" "Certainly not. Ridiculous." Then she said, "Could it possibly be Rumpelstiltskin?" "Oh! Somebody told you!" he shouted. "Some blabbermouth told you!" And he was so mad he stamped his foot and stamped it right through the floor. They had to pull him out. and he limped away, muttering to himself, "Always somebody spoiling the game." And that was the last that was ever seen of him, the old goat. Once there was a poor widow woman who lived with her only son, a boy named Jack. They lived in a tiny little cottage at the foot of a high, steep cliff, and they had a pretty hard time getting along. Often there wasn't really enough for them to eat. And then one winter, Jack's mother was sick, fever and chills and so on, and things got so bad she finally decided to sell the family cow. The cow had been with them a good many years, but there was nothing else to do. So one morning, Jack started off to the market to sell her. He hadn't gone very far, though, when he met a man sitting beside the road with a basket full of beautiful beans. They were extraordinary-looking beans, all different colors, blue and red and yellow, and Jack stopped to admire them. "Those are certainly beautiful beans," he remarked to the man. "If I had any money, I'd buy 'em." The bean man gave him a nice, friendly smile and said, "Well, my boy, seeing it's you, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'll trade those beautiful beans for that old cow you've got there." Yeah. And the boy fell for it. Well, sir, when Jack got home and showed his mother what he'd got for the cow, a handful of beans, the poor woman burst into tears. She scolded Jack, and Jack said he was sorry, but of course there was nothing he could do, except plant the beans in the backyard. He did that right away. And next morning, what do you suppose he saw? During the night, the beans had climbed right up the side of the cliff behind the house, and they'd grown so fast the tops of the beanstalks were clear out of sight. And the way the stalks were intertwined, they formed a kind of ladder. And you know what popped into Jack's head as soon as he saw it? I could climb it, he thought to himself. So he started up the beanstalk. He climbed, and he climbed, and he climbed, and he climbed. Then all of a sudden he looked down. It was so far to the ground he was dizzy. But he shut his eyes and gritted his teeth and kept on climbing. And pretty soon he was at the top. He stepped off the beanstalk and found himself standing before a beautiful castle, the biggest, most beautiful castle he'd ever seen. And he was just wondering who lived there when he heard a voice call his name. My goodness, Jack thought, who knows me way up here? Then he heard the voice say, "Jack, in this castle lives the giant who killed your father. This castle and all the treasures in it rightfully belong to you and your mother. A hen that lays golden eggs, and many bags of gold, and a magic harp." Jack looked around, but he couldn't see anyone, so he decided the voice must belong to a fairy, and he was probably right. He went boldly up to the castle gate and blew on the horn that was standing there. They had horns instead of doorbells in those days. In a moment, the gate swung open, and there stood an enormous lady giant. She was a good 20 feet tall, with nasty little red eyes and long, scraggly hair. And when Jack saw her, he was the scaredest boy that ever climbed a beanstalk. Now change the record, and we'll see what happened. Well, when Jack saw the lady giant, he started to run. But she just reached out and grabbed him by the coat collar with one finger and hoisted him up in the air. "Not so fast, little man," she said. "I need a cute little fellow like you to help me with my housework." "Oh, no," said Jack. "Please let me go." But the lady giant said, "You better be quiet, little man. If my husband should wake up and hear you, he'd eat you for breakfast." And with that, she carried Jack into the castle, shut the door, and set him to washing the giant's supper dishes from the night before. And no hot water. As he was finishing, he heard a terrifying sound. Clump, clump, clump. Someone with size 36 shoes was coming down the stairs. "Quick," said the lady giant. "Here comes my husband. Hide in this cupboard here." So Jack hid in a huge cupboard in the kitchen, but he could peep out through the keyhole and see everything that happened. Well, evidently the giant thought something funny was going on. He came tromping into the kitchen and he roared, "Fee-fi-fo-fum! I smell the blood of an Englishman!" But Mrs. Giant said to her husband, "What's the matter with you this morning, dear? There's no one around. What you smell is an elephant steak I fixed for your breakfast. Now sit down and eat it, for goodness sake." So the giant sat down, a little grumpily, and Jack peeped through the keyhole and watched him shovel in the food. A quarter of an elephant the giant ate, with 100 boiled eggs, and a couple of loaves of toast on the side. And his table manners, well, I hope yours are nothing like them. When the giant finished, he said to his wife, "Now, dear, bring me my magic hen." And she hurried and brought him a little brown hen, set it on the table, and ran off upstairs to make the beds. When the giant was alone, he looked at the hen ferociously and said, "Lay!" And the little brown hen laid a golden egg, like that. And the giant said again, "Lay!" And she laid another one. And the third time the little hen laid a golden egg. And with that the giant fell fast asleep. And oh, how he snored. But as soon as Jack saw the giant was asleep, he popped out of the cupboard, grabbed the hen, and ran like a blue streak out of the kitchen door. And he climbed down the beanstalk much faster than he came up. Well, naturally, Jack's mother was delighted to see him. But when Jack told her he was going back to the giant's castle for the other treasures, she was terribly frightened. And it took a lot of coaxing before she finally gave her consent. So in the morning, he disguised himself a little, climbed the beanstalk, and blew the horn at the castle gate. And Mrs. Giant came right out and hired him to do housework, just as she had the day before. She wasn't very smart, but most giants aren't, fortunately. Oop! Time to change the record. Jack went in the castle and did a little housework. And then down the stairs came the giant again. Clump, clump, clump. And his feet sounded even bigger than the first time. The lady giant popped Jack into the cupboard, and just as he was inside, he heard the giant roar, "Fee-fi-fo-fum! I smell the blood of an Englishman! Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread!" Jack shivered in the cupboard, but Mrs. Giant just laughed at her husband and said, "I don't know what's getting into you, my dear. There's nobody around but just little me." And she sat her husband down to his breakfast of a dozen roast turkeys with a barrel of cranberry sauce. When he'd finished, she brought him his bags of gold, and then went upstairs to make his bed. And the giant amused himself by counting his gold. There was plenty of it, too, until he fell fast asleep. No sooner was he asleep than Jack jumped out of the cupboard, picked up the bags of gold, and ran for the beanstalk. In a moment, he was at the bottom, faster than ever. And before you could say Jack and the beanstalk, he was pouring the bags of shiny gold pieces into his mother's lap. But he was determined to go once more and get the magic harp. So the next morning he got up early, climbed the beanstalk, and went to the castle gate and blew on the horn. Out popped the lady giant. She looked at him suspiciously. "You aren't the boy I hired yesterday, are you?" she asked. "Who, me?" said Jack. "I've never been here before in my life." Mrs. Giant took him in, and when the giant came clumping down the stairs, she pushed Jack into the cupboard as before. "Fee-fi-fo-fum! I smell the blood of an Englishman! Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread! And this time I mean it!" "It's your imagination, dear," said his wife, and she made him sit down and eat his breakfast, a fricasseed horse. And then he asked for his magic harp. When she brought it, the giant set the harp down beside him, and he said, "Play!" And the harp played a lovely, sad little song all by itself. In fact, it was so nice, the giant went fast asleep. Zing! Jack was out of the cupboard. Whoop! He grabbed the magic harp. The harp began to holler. "Master, master!" cried the harp. The giant woke up and saw Jack tearing out of the door with the harp under his arm. And he jumped up and tore out after him, puffing like a locomotive. Jack reached the beanstalk first and went down it just like opening a zipper. But as he reached the ground, he looked up and saw the giant clambering down after him. The beanstalk swayed, but it was holding, and Jack called to his mother, "Mother, bring me the axe, please." Jack always said please. His mother came rushing out with a family hatchet, and Jack hacked and chopped, and just as the giant was almost on top of him, the last stalk gave way, and he fell to the ground and broke his neck. And if you ask me, it was his own fault. Anyhow, Jack and his mother went up and lived in the castle with their magic harp and the little brown hen, and they were mighty happy. Well, who wouldn't be?